Welcome to the Soulful Sound Podcast, where you will find conscious, inspiring content to support your healing and transformation. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I want to extend a heartfelt invitation for you to be part of our community, where more insightful conversations await to guide you to heal, grow, and thrive. Simply click the subscribe button. It means the world to me. Your support, your comments, everything is truly incredible. And we're only at the beginning of this awesome journey together. I'm so excited to be on this adventure with you, and your subscription is a valuable part of making it all happen. Thank you so much for joining, sending you love, healing, and sound wherever you are. Welcome, everyone, and welcome back to the Soulful Sound Podcast. I am joined by the awesome Michael Reiley, who is a musician, producer, and educator focused on helping others to awaken their innate capacity to listen and resonate with the interconnected web of inner and outer soundscapes. You're speaking my language. Welcome, Michael. Welcome.
Thank you, Simone. So fabulous to be here.
Yeah.
I've never heard my bio read with such enthusiasm and skill. I'll have to add like a little audio player and you can read it on the website.
That's funny. You know, I get that a lot on this podcast. I really love reading people's bios or just introducing you, because the work that you're doing is so important. And I particularly love there's a lot that we can pull from that, but I love the inner and outer. And that interconnectedness, and then of course the awakening and the listening and the resonance. There's something that really, calls to my heart in those words. So it's very easy to connect with them when I read them as well.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yes. So I start a lot of my podcasts really with just a little bit about my guests, your personal story that got you into the work you're doing today and where you are. You can share as little or as much of it as you like, just giving me a little idea of how you got to where you are right now with this amazing work you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been playing music basically my whole life. I started piano when I was 8 years old or so. Through my teenage years and 20s, I played keyboards mostly in bands. And I still do that. That's still my primary instrument, and the way my heart can express itself is just to sit down at the piano and just flow along. It's so ingrained in my body, let's say. So my hands just kind of, I'm not a great pianist. I'm not like a concert pianist or even as good as probably good enough to be a session musician, but it is the primary way that I like to express myself. Yeah. And during that time, during the time when I was playing in bands, I was playing in rock bands, but also kind of like electronic music projects where we'd have like people on turntables and a live drummer, and I was playing synthesizers. I was always very interested in the sort of sound design and ambient textures. So that's a lot of what I brought to the projects I was involved in at that time. And during the same time, I had a pretty serious meditation practice that followed a pretty, let's say, common American route, which is kind of like the mindfulness schools of like Jack Kornfield, Tara Brach, Joseph Goldstein, people like that. And so I went on a few meditation retreats and was practicing at home. And I always kind of felt they were separate worlds. So I was involved in this ambient music work that I was starting to do as a solo composer and producer. I was beginning to create scores for dancers and theater companies and doing a little bit of film scoring even. And I had this meditation practice that I felt was very separate. So I had like my meditation friends that I would see on retreat, or I would started going to a local sangha in Mount Airy in Philadelphia, where I'm from. But I had my music friends over here. And all of that changed when I met a composer and artist named Pauline Oliveros in 2007. And she created, along with Ione and Eloise Gold, a practice called deep listening. And with a lot of things in deep listening, the transformation in me was kind of slow, but a seed was planted when I met her and had the privilege to work with her and a number of other composers and musicians on a project in 2007, studying deep listening and preparing. We did a concert together as basically a deep listening music ensemble that she curated and led. So this sort of planted the seed that my music and meditation worlds didn't necessarily need to be separate.
Do you feel called to use your voice and sound in a healing capacity? Learn how to use your voice therapeutically to facilitate healing and well-being. Whether you want to go deeper in your own healing journey or facilitate others in theirs, this training is for you. This online training runs over 5 weekends and offers theory, practice, resources, and support on your path to becoming a qualified sound healer and for your personal healing journey. Yeah.
And like I said, it was a slow process. I remember I went on a 3-day silent retreat in 2012, I think. And I was practicing kind of classic Vipassana style, just paying attention to what is, just noticing the unfolding of reality. And I found myself really attracted to the soundscape where I was doing the meditation practice. And
Yes.
at the time I was living in a city. So when I practiced at home, I think my listening was very contained because there was so much noise outside. There was so much traffic and just sounds of the city. But I noticed on this retreat, which was in rural Pennsylvania, well, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, really. And I noticed that my listening was very expansive. So I was really taking in a wide, much further field of listening than I had ever experienced. And I was really kind of savoring the texture and the details of that sound field as I was meditating. And it was just it's hard to describe in words, but it was just a really transformative and expansive sense of self where it, it was difficult to feel if the sounds were coming to me or if my consciousness was expanding to meet the sounds that were very distant and far away. That might not sound so profound, but at the moment, the feeling of it and the resonance of it really changed. And I said, okay, music and meditation, mindfulness, listening, all of these things are really one current, and that was a shift for me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, love that. So, well, for anyone listening, because you use the word deep listening quite a few times, what
Mhm.
is deep listening? Because, of course, we all have some capacity to listen in
Mhm.
whatever way, shape, or form. And there is something that's been developed in this particular, well, like you said, Pauline's work and, what you've done and how you're bringing it all together. So, what is deep listening? Is it that expansiveness that you're referring to?
It is. So there are a lot of different, let's say, schools of deep listening. Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, he talks a lot about deep listening in his book Silence.
Mm,
And the type of deep listening he's talking about is more of let's say, a heart-centered form of dialogue with other people. So it's about listening with compassion and kindness and a non-judgmental, non-reactive state.
yes.
And the deep listening I'm talking about specifically with Pauline Oliveros is it's almost a pun she came up with because she had a group called the Deep Listening Band with herself, Stuart Dempster, and a singer named Pantois. And they were doing concerts and recording in an underground cistern. So they had to actually climb down ladders with their instruments into this deep underground cistern. And the cistern they were recording in had this really cavernous, long reverb tail to all the sounds.
Wow.
And so she started to just take a lot of the practices that she had been developing since the 60s, let's say 70s and 80s, and she sort of included that in the umbrella of deep listening. And along with her partner Ione, whose practice is primarily dealing with listening and dreams practice, and their other collaborator Eloise Gold, who talked about the deeply listening body, an invitation to full body listening. And they developed through a series of retreats and an online program that's hosted at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I'm a teacher now of this practice. They created something called deep listening, which is, she acknowledges Thich Nhat Hanh's work in deep listening. And people, yeah, they'll talk about maybe listening to an album as a form of deep listening, or listening in meditation as deep listening. And of course, Pauline didn't invent listening. You know, a lot of indigenous practices and ancient practices are about listening, and we live in a sort of noisy, media filled culture, And I think people are really awakening to the power of what listening can give us, and how we can really connect with each other in this noisy mediascape, let's say, and how listening can be a transformative tool for presence. And yeah, it's really a lifelong practice.
Yeah.
And ironically enough, when people would ask Pauline, what is deep listening in interviews and things like that, she, especially towards the end of her life, she died in 2016. And towards the end of her life, she said, I don't know. That was her answer. What is deep listening? It's the unfolding I don't know-ness of the present moment. It's the ability to be silent and to bear witness and to listen with our full bodies and our full selves to everything all of the time, and remind ourselves when we are not listening. That was what she also said deep listening was.
I love that.
Yeah.
It really speaks, as you said, this unfolding and this evolution. It's like there's no end. It is that practice and continuous journey. And I do remember years ago, because my background in music and singing, it spans most of my lifetime. But when I came towards sound from a therapeutic and healing capacity, and I went deeper into understanding, well, let's say the mind part, which is the science and the thoughts and so on, but then the experiential and intuitive piece, which was just letting go and letting the sounds carry me, the silences always felt different. And then what I started to notice was the sounds of everything around me, like the radiator humming in the house that's giving us heat has a buzz that I didn't notice before. And in that sound, there's some harmonics. How come these sounds are all present all of a sudden? They were always there. So because of my understanding of my experience of the interplay between sound and silence, can you speak a little bit to that? I know you're also a musician, you use sound a lot in your work. Can you talk a little bit about that interplay between sound and silence?
Yeah, silence is a really profound and deep mystery. And uh, it's so we often think of silence as an absolute state. So we think of it as an absence. I tend to flip that around. And this is something that is talked about in Buddhism in terms of emptiness.
Yes.
So emptiness is a concept that to Western ears sounds a little depressing. Like, oh man, there's nothing in here. It's empty. But really, emptiness in a Buddhist tradition is talking about the substrate, the interconnected substrate, and you mentioned science. So this is the field, the quantum field from which anything can emerge and everything dissolves back into. So I think of silence as that substrate, as that field of potentiality where sounds can emerge. And it's so transformative when we start to listen to silence. Our senses are tuned to really focus on the foreground of experience. That's visually and sonically, where we don't notice the space between the notes. We notice the notes themselves. Just evolutionarily, that's how our senses evolved. But when we start to really pay attention to the pauses,
Yes,
to the silence, to those moments when we get in the car, let's say, and we don't turn the radio on, and there's just that vacuum, and you're like, and that silence has no end also, which is really profound. It's like there are certainly pockets of silence, like in the car example, but we can't really find a barrier to that. So that silence that we're experiencing in a quiet car is the same silence that's present, let's say, in a church or a mosque. It's the same silence that's present in a library. It's the same silence that we find in deep space. And to bring it back to science, once again, we know that most of reality, when we look as above, so below, is empty space, is actually that potentiality for anything to emerge. And that expansiveness that we think about going out into the infinite universe, we have that same expansiveness inside of us. So that's why in my bio, I mentioned the inner and outer soundscapes and the harmonization of that inner and outer.
Yeah. And I know that obviously there is training in deep listening, and there are a lot of different things that you could share about it. For anyone listening who says, well, that's interesting, how do I even begin that journey of listening to sound with my whole body, or harmonizing the inner and outer landscapes. I'm
Mhm.
sure that's a conversation on its own, but can you speak to that a little bit, into some of the ways we can begin that journey?
Sure. Well, one way is I actually host a weekly meditation on sound group called Sound Sangha. So you're welcome to join that. It's free to attend. It's every Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern time in New York City time.
Mhm.
And it's a 45-minute meditation class where I'll introduce a topic for 10 minutes. And then we have about 20 minutes of practice where sometimes I'll do a guided meditation. Sometimes I play music. Sometimes we listen to music.
Mm.
Like recently, we listened to "A Love Supreme" by John Coltrane as a sonic meditation, just like listening to that in a deep listening way, which is also really profound and beautiful to just spend time with other people listening to something.
Mm.
It's on Zoom too. I didn't say that, but yeah, it's on Zoom, so it's accessible to anyone around the world who
Amazing.
has Zoom. So that's one way to connect. You mentioned there is, for people that are interested in really studying the core of deep listening, there are deep listening intensives that are offered by Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
Mm.
But listening has no barrier, you know, and it really depends on your life circumstances. Let's say, I think it's important to be mindful of that some people live in noisy cities and they can't get out of those noisy cities. They just don't have the means. But if you do have the means to even find a park, a city park, or um, yeah, just to find spaces of quiet.
Yeah.
um, there's a lot of social dynamics to this, because some people don't feel safe listening, and that's,
Mm.
if they're in their particular environment where it's noisy or violent or
Yeah.
chaotic. It's really hard to develop that sense of listening. And I notice, um, about 5 years ago, I was working in an inner city school in Philadelphia at the Village of Arts and Humanities, it's called. And it was a project for kids growing up in the inner city to, they studied lots of different art practices. So ceramics and music, there was a music program, and theater, dance, all sorts of really beautiful things. And I was there teaching about podcasting, actually. Um, and I noticed that a lot of kids in this neighborhood always had earbuds in.
Mhm.
And I think that was a way to kind of curate their own sound world, to kind of create a musical sound, a landscape that was whatever it was, YouTube or Spotify, or um, because the soundscapes there were so harsh.
Yeah.
So ways to practice deep listening, yeah, like I said, if you can go to nature, that's a great place to go. Um, and it's really simple. It's just to sit still, because stillness and silence are sisters in this practice. So silence is the relative non-moving of air particles, let's say.
Mm.
So when we still the body, it's kind of an invitation for silence to come as well.
Mm.
And listening to sounds is a doorway, a gateway to one of the most profound aspects of Buddhism, which is impermanence. So when we listen to sound, it's like, a common analogy is like surfing. So we're simply surfing a wave of the present moment, and we're just noticing what's here, what's here, what's here. And like what you were saying earlier, that when we find that stillness and that silence and that presence, we start to notice sounds that were unnoticed before. So you mentioned the
Mm.
buzzing of your refrigerator being in tune, the pitch of that. We start to notice these really magical synchronicities in our sound world.
Mm.
And in every moment, sounds are usually changing. So they're either changing their pitch or their timbre, or the periodicity, the pulses are changing over time. And so it's a constant invitation to come back into the present moment, when we're able to sit in stillness and relative silence and just notice the sounds around us. And it's a practice, I framed it as trying to find a silent place to do it, and to, a park, or even, a church or a yoga studio or a library. But once you're able to practice in silence, you can start to integrate more and more real world examples of this.
Yeah.
And some of my work with a project I have called Listening Bodies with my partner, Monica. We do sound walks in different places.
Mm.
And sometimes we do them in nature, but sometimes we do them in Home Depots. We go into big hardware stores and just walk around in silence, listening to what's happening there. And then the practice starts to expand, and you notice I can listen all day long. I can listen and be present and treat each sound as like a meditation bell, bringing us back into the present moment again and again and again.
Yeah. That is beautiful. I very much relate to that. I've been meditating for a very long time, well, majority of my life, and with that, um, I'm sure it didn't start there, but it certainly is now a place where meditation can be found in the simplest forms of, cleaning my house and or just doing simple tasks, but also being able to sit on a tour bus. When I was touring quite a lot back in the day, everyone's busy talking and doing their own thing, and being able to sit still and go into that place in those environments, that was really precious to be able to facilitate that for myself, because it really, that grounding, especially in that busy music industry life, it was such a healing and grounded way to approach it.
Mm.
I do have a question about the listening piece, because so far, and I know that you didn't speak directly to it this way, but a lot of what we've spoken about so far starts with the listening. And obviously listening, you're talking about that open body, whole body listening, not just listening through the ears, which we have often as a misconception that we hear everything through the ears, where with vibration, what's audible, we might hear through our ears, but the frequencies and the vibrations are all happening through our entire energetic systems. And so I want to talk a little bit about the, let's say, the inner landscapes. So not necessarily listening on the outs for the sounds that are coming from the outside, but the sounds that we might be hearing on the inside. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So I mentioned the quote from the Hermetic Emerald Tablet, as above, so below. And so as we develop our ears and our bodies to become attuned to outer soundscapes, we
Yes.
start to notice a sympathetic resonance that's happening inside. So if you're doing, I know you work in sound healing, so if we're presenting those sort of frequencies externally on someone's body, whether that's like bowls played on the body, or the beautiful koshi bells I see behind you, or
Yeah.
piano, or even sounds of nature, so the natural sounds that can heal the body, we start to notice that the inner body, the inner landscape, starts to change accordingly. And I often talk about it in terms of tuning the inner and outer landscapes, and that's actually a title of a book. Um, sorry, I'm blanking on the writer's name. Tuning. Yeah, I'll look it up and send it to you. Maybe we can
Yeah, yeah,
mention it in the show
yeah,
notes.
for sure.
But yeah, it's about finding that we have an inner orchestra and there's an outer orchestra playing, that we don't really have much control over. So if we're able to, like you said, you were sitting on a tour bus and you were able to have the presence of mind to drop into that state of mindfulness. And often when people meditate for a long time, they develop a sort of inner somatic knowing of what stillness and mindfulness is. And that's part of, I think, the reason that's called a practice, because you sort of develop that somatic inner body knowing of what it means to be still and present and calm. And it's something that the outer world can't disturb. It's a stillness, it's a presence that we can develop inwardly that's untouched and can be untouched by the outer world. And in terms of listening, this, I think, is probably more related to the Thich Nhat Hanh school of deep listening, where we develop our ability to communicate compassionately with other people, and then we can turn that around on ourselves, and that presents itself as being less judgmental, less reactive, less harsh with ourselves when we're, all the little personalities that we have inside of us when they're having their discussions. We can recognize, let's say, the inner child, and we can speak to and listen to the inner child compassionately, and yeah, just be present and practice that compassionate listening for those people inside of us.
Yeah. I love that. That is beautiful. I mean, I speak a lot about the internal dialogue in my work in terms of voice, using voice, the inner voice, and then how you express and how you align that. I talk about authenticity from a perspective of being a revolving door between your inner universe and the outer world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not static. There's always a movement. You come out, there's stimuli, there's all the stuff you said, certain things that you can't control. And then you go in and check in with yourself, pause, take note, just sit with it, and then I let that go back out. And when you speak about that in the somatic experience, it reminds me a lot of some of those practices where it is really that intentional pause and stillness to allow yourself to sense and notice whatever might be unfolding in those moments. So I love the way you've described it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
noticing is just another way of saying listening.
Yeah.
And that's part of the work of deep listening and sort of sonic mindfulness is noticing that listening is more than just about sound. You know, it's an attitude. It's a turning around of our attention to become present to what is.
Yes, that's beautiful. And to speak more on music, because I've been so fortunate to hear some of your incredible music, which I absolutely resonate with. It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
And I want to know a bit more about your musical journey. So I know you've got a lot of different projects, and that over the years your path would have changed as we all evolve and grow artistically. Tell me a little bit about how that's changed for you over the last few years.
Yeah, for sure. It was, I would say, up until about 2020, the time of the pandemic, I was connected with a style of music that was, yeah, I was sort of in the art music world, let's say. So I was creating music for art installations and creating music that I would present at concerts for a specific type of audience that was interested in not so experimental. I hesitate to say the word experimental, but yeah, just to, I was using a lot of field recording, so kind of using field recordings as a medium that I would manipulate digitally and create these new sonic landscapes, and I would kind of play with those. That was my primary instrument around like 2015 to 2020. I was traveling a lot, so I was doing a lot of recording of different environments. Even at that point, I was already kind of talking about it as inner and outer landscape. So I would kind of treat these field recordings digitally in a way that would pull out for me what was the emotional resonance. So if it was the sounds of a jungle in Costa Rica, I would add these sort of sonic textures to it that would kind of sonically say how I was feeling in that place. Yeah, and that sort of shifted for me around the pandemic. I had always had this interest in the kind of work that you do, sound healing or therapeutic music. And I started working in a program called the Music for Healing and Transition program at that time. And I don't know, I think a lot of people had this shift in 2020 of the pandemic of like really just getting to the essence of what is it I want to be doing. We see people getting sick, some people dying.
Yeah.
We see life is short, and the world was changing so much at that time, even before the pandemic. And I just felt a calling to get involved more in the healing aspects of music.
Yeah.
So I did this program, and I actually started it in 2018. So I was kind of in the midst of it when the pandemic started, and I finished it in 2022. And the Music for Healing and Transition program is their website's mhtp.org. It's a US based program where you are trained to play basically improvised music at the bedside of people that are either in the hospital or in hospice. And that's where I was working a lot with hospice. Um, I shouldn't say improvised, because some MHT people actually have a repertoire of songs that they play, but the way I did it was improvised, because I was playing the Rav Vest, which is a hung drum type instrument called the handpan. So it's like a circular instrument. People probably know this by now, especially that
Yeah.
listen to your podcast.
Yeah.
that
Maybe, but yes.
what a hung drum is. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
basically like 8 or 9 or sometimes 11 notes in a circle, and they're all kind of in key with each other. So I love this instrument, and I have a few of them now, because it really connects my left and right brain, because
Mm.
there are no wrong notes. So you can kind of just get into the geometry of hitting notes in certain patterns. And it kind of connects rhythm and melody and harmony, and it
Yeah.
just has a really beautiful sound.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was working in the program, and the program really teaches you really beautiful things. If anyone's interested in this work in therapeutic music, I highly recommend it, because they teach you a lot about like how different modes and scales
Mm.
connect to different ways to deal with people's pain, let's say, or anxiety.
Yeah.
And one of the beautiful things in this program they teach you is that um, as opposed to music therapy, which has a sort of outcome based practice. And usually the difference between therapeutic music and music therapy is music therapy often uses recorded music,
Mm.
and they kind of want to have an outcome. So they want to help someone who, has, let's say, anxiety or some sort of PTSD or something like that. They want to kind of get them from a, a, an acute state to a more stable state.
Mhm.
Whereas the therapeutic music that's taught in my program is just really about meeting people where they are. So we would learn how to use tempo and scales of music, modal music, to really match the patient and where they were. And
Yeah.
what I was doing was playing for people in hospice. So it was really people who were very at the end of their lives, and in some cases in the active dying process. So
Mm.
the music I was playing was really about it was really sacred. It was a really beautiful time in my life to be with people. And the hospice I was playing at was sort of a low income hospice, let's say. Sometimes it was even homeless people who had no one else,
Mm.
and I would be, maybe one of the last people that would see them. There was a really wonderful staff of nurses who was always there, and chaplains and things like that. But for the pretty much everyone I played for was just really grateful. If they were conscious, they were really grateful to receive that gift of music. And so many traditions embrace sound and listening as a ritual for letting go at the end of life.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that was the work I was doing there. Um,
Mm. That's beautiful.
was yeah through MHTP. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that work because it's so needed. And I think what a gift to be able to give someone in those moments, there it's so precious and I don't take those things for granted. So I celebrate that. Thank you. I have a question as you speak about, because I know you're a musician, so you can speak about modes and scales and all the musical terms that we will learn as musicians. And because I know too that you are working with meditation and deep listening, and as you said, there were points where there were some levels where things might have felt separate, because I remembered actually going through moments where I started to bring more therapeutic or personal development things into my life. And I was like, hang on, it feels like I'm cheating on music. Something felt weird at that point where it was like my identity was all, I'm a singer, this is what I do. And then all of a sudden I'm bringing all this other stuff in.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that is to say you marry them beautifully now. And my question really is around how you then underneath that embed the marriage between your intuition and then your the science and knowledge that obviously backs up the work that you do in all the different forms that it happens. So that intuitive piece, really.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
So I think I've always been pretty intuitive when it comes to music. I've always been drawn to improvisation and yeah, just sort of trusting the process, because I've done a lot of technical work in my life, doing like websites and computer programming. So I've always looked at music as a way to let go of the analytical and structural. Yet at the same time, there's an inherent architecture and symmetry and order to music that can be met. So yeah, it's I guess I use my intuition to kind of balance the two, because I do create albums and things that are using really specific frequencies and sort of precise mathematical formulas. Like I did an album about the movements of the planets that used all the measurements of the size of the planet and how fast it moves, and I would dial in really specific frequencies in my software to do all that. Because I love science, I love arts, and I don't really see them as so separate. I see them as kind of like two rivers leading to one ocean. And to me, it's just different ways to connect with the absolute and the relative natures of reality. For me, spirituality and mysticism and the divine are the absolute nature of reality, and the relative is the changing, the microscopic, the way that we use science and engineering and things like that to get into the nitty gritty of reality as it's of the absolute as it's manifest here. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, it did in some ways. I mean, food for
yeah.
thought for sure. It's as you know, there's no wrong answer. So I think that what I understand and like in that is again, it's referring to that inner and outer. There is very much that approach in many ways. I know for me, when I was learning sound healing years ago, and I was in the session, and my teacher at the time, she gave us all the theory, and we were talking about the science, and then we were talking about the intuition, because someone had said, well, how do I know that this is my intuition and it's not just some, I don't know, internal dialogue that's coming from, how do I know what my intuition is, and how, or whether the information that I'm getting is right? Like the inner dialogue that often comes up when in these practices, and I work a lot with people this way now, is that, I don't know, is what I'm hearing real, or is it right, or do I share it? All these questions that the mind gets into play with. And what I enjoyed in my own practices, well, let's start from the mind, a very simple reframe of, but what if it is? It's just information. It's not something you need to judge. It's not something you need to understand. It's not something you need to be right or wrong on. It's just whatever's coming up. And then from the inner landscape, for me, it is very embodied, and it feels there's a sense and a knowing when it's not about that logic or understanding what's going on from the headpiece. It doesn't have to make sense, yet there is this sense of knowing and truth within it. And that's a beautiful seed for me, where intuition then can grow, and then you expand, and then of course go through the motions of building a relationship with it.
Yeah, definitely. That resonates a lot with me. And I think let's say the science part of it is a lot in the planning,
Yeah.
So you're a beautiful singer. I've listened to your recordings
Thank
as
you.
well. And I know from hearing the way that you sing, you've probably studied scales and maybe with the piano, and have like really worked out, okay, this is this interval. If I want to sing a fourth, it's like this. And you're kind of training your body to respond to that. But then when it gets to the time of performance, all of that is sort of programmed somehow inside of us, and we can just like let go and trust our intuition in the moment, because we've done the work, we've done the sort of meticulous work.
Yeah.
Something that's coming to mind too is I'm constantly one of my favorite things to do is to read about people fighting over 432 tuning, whether it's complete nonsense, it's just new age stuff, or if it was some diabolical plan by the Nazis or the British to reprogram us all to make us tune to 440. And there's a lot of nuance in that. But one thing I always think about is when people do use the 432 tuning system, so they take the time to, let's say, recalibrate their synthesizer, or they buy crystal bowls that are tuned to 432, or they take that extra step to not just go with the default, but to say, yeah, I'm actually playing instruments that were carefully chosen, that when you look at the chart of all the frequencies in 432, there's all these beautiful patterns of whole numbers that we see in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just setting that intention of like, I'm not just going with the default thing here. I'm actually choosing a tuning system that is associated with healing and with recovery and with beauty, with aesthetic beauty. And we know the placebo effect of that can be as profound as anything else. I don't know how you feel about the science of sound healing, but my experience of it is that the body has a profound ability to heal itself. We see that if we get a cut, and it heals itself. It's miraculous.
Yes,
Um,
for sure.
but often we either psychologically or from our traumas or our upbringings, we've blocked that ability for the body to heal itself. And I find that using sound healing, whether as a listener or a practitioner, it's giving the body a signal that it's okay to heal.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a soundtrack to let the body relax and just go, okay, I can heal if it's possible for me with this disease or suffering that I'm going through right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I literally in my content creation this week created a reel on that, kind of in a way calling out people who say I can heal you, or
Right.
letting people know, that's a red flag. It is really creating the space for that innate natural way of healing. As you said, the body knows what to do. And that is just creating the space for it to happen. And as a sound healer, all I am is a catalyst and an instrument to support that natural healing, to kind of get it back into its like you said, a signal. How do we get our bodies back in tune? We just play the frequencies using intention, using the understanding of how these notes might affect our energetic, subtle bodies and systems, and let the body then find its way through that. And not just the body, the whole being, which is energy, right? And this for me is the fundamentals. And I got a little bit like, why are so many people saying, come to me and I'll heal you? I just don't understand that. So I did have a little rant. My reel will probably go out next week on that. So you picked up on it. I completely relate to yours, your view of that. And I would agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it is important because sound healing is a pretty new phenomenon, at least in the West. And yeah, there are some sort of problematic framings of it that, I've worked with people sometimes and they say, oh, my ankle hurts. What frequency do you have for that? And I was like, well, every body is different, but,
Yes.
so there's not a specific frequency for your ankle, but I will play some music and some sounds and frequencies, and let the ankle heal itself when it's time, and just use the music as a soundtrack to relax, to not
Yes.
hold, to not block that energy, because a lot of times it's like you said, the body is energy, and we're subconsciously and consciously blocking energies, the healing energies in our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think the majority of the role for me as a sound healing teacher is I always use the analogy, and I know you'll understand. I said, when we're talking theory and science and all of these things that I'm using words to describe, we're learning the scales, and that's all. And then as a sound healer, then there is that intuition, that being free to improvise. So I talk about the chakras, I talk about this and that, but if you don't sing an ooh here, or you don't use the red for the root chakra, does it mean a different one is being activated? It's like, if that's what it means to you,
Yeah.
so there is an element of, okay, we learn the scale so that we can go off and improvise and just do whatever it is that we want. On top of that, the grounding and the understanding of it is helpful, mostly because a lot of people don't understand. And it's an entry level into understanding that it's not just, I don't know, maybe spiritual and woke and woo-woo stuff, that those are the words that come around a lot of this kind of work. that people just think they don't understand. And so for me, the science very often helps to back it up for people
Yeah.
to understand that piece.
Yeah. Yeah. Science in many ways is the new religion of our times. So if you sort of speak in that language, it allows certain people to come to the table
Yes.
and appreciate it. Things like the chakras and the different frequencies of the chakras, that's also giving respect to the lineage of things like nada yoga
Yes.
and the idea that we do have frequency centers in our body, and you can sing certain notes that resonate and vibrate those
Yes.
areas. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And I would love to know more about the improv side, because as
Mhm.
much as my background as a singer, and yes, I do know the scales, and I do know I understand music and the structure and order, the mathematics, if you like.
Mhm.
Um, when I am now in my expression, and I know you said you've listened to some of my music, when I go into the studio now to create, it is very little. It's like the 70-30 in terms of head and heart, right? 70
Mhm.
is the heart piece,
Mhm.
and 30 might be, well, let's see if we can play with something around this theme and just see what comes up. But when I vocalized it, it feels very much, the improv feels very much like a channeled experience where you use the expression, there are no wrong notes. When I first started this process, the musician singer part of me would be like, hang on, you're pitchy, or hang on, that note's not quite. And then
Mhm.
I let that go, because actually it actually disrupted the flow of energy and the flow of the sonic flow that wanted to naturally come out, which I no longer, I just let whatever wants to come out, come out.
Mhm.
And so it's a really beautiful experience for me. And I'm curious about your relationship to improv.
Mhm. Yeah, that ratio of 70-30, that feels familiar to me too, I think. um no, I've always loved improv. Even when I was composing music, let's say, or calling myself a composer, it was often just improvisations that I remembered. That was all composing
I
was. I
like
would
that.
improvise something and just remember it and be like, there's the piece.
Yeah.
Or even more sophisticated, I would use software. I would just like sit with a MIDI controller and just record everything I was playing and then go back and then re-edit it and kind of fine tune it. But it was always an improvisation. And
Mm.
many of the music projects I was talking about earlier, like the live electronic music, we would improvise most of it. We would just have like certain themes that we could return to. But I've always loved that energy, because I think that people, whether it's a large audience or you're working one-on-one with you,
Mhm.
they really can respond to that co-creation,
Yeah.
that there is no plan here. This is all being created in the moment together. um, and to
Yeah.
bring it back to Pauline, she would talk about the importance of that field of listening, that excitement that's created by a captivated audience or a single person
Mm.
who's there with you, as it all unfolds and gets co-created in improvisation.
Yeah. Yes, I love that. The collaboration, the offering, that, bringing all of it, really, it's so beautiful. In terms of improvising.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to dig a little deeper into that landscape for you, because like I said, for me it feels, especially in the context of voicing, that I am free, and there is a, I use the word channeling, but it might not be the best word, it's just what came out at the time, but it feels like a stream of sonic consciousness that is flowing through me in the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way that you could describe what your improv feels like from the inner landscape perspective?
Yeah, it's very active, and it does feel like you're sort of surrendering to something that you don't know what the outcome's going to be. And for me, the best improvs are the ones where I'm so in it, note for note, and like in this really beautiful landscape where it's just happening, whether I'm playing by myself or with a group of people.
Mhm.
And it's exciting. It's electric. And the
Mm.
best ones are the ones that you record these improvisations, whether it's solo or with a group, and you listen back to it and you're like, I don't remember that. where did
Yeah.
who's playing that?
Yeah.
It's just this, you're so lost that the sense of the self gets so lost that you're
Mhm.
just like completely surrendering to this
Yeah.
energy you're talking about, that you feel come through you. That resonates with me too. This idea that it's almost like you're channeling something beyond you,
Mhm.
and you're also somehow channeling the past versions of yourself
Mhm.
that did all the rehearsals,
Yes.
like you're able to play scales or sing scales or rhythms that you've practiced and have become so internalized in you. um, and also
Yeah.
I love improvising in a group for that reason too, that you have these dialogues and conversations that
Mhm.
if you just listen while you're improvising, there's always someone's always playing something new that you can respond to. So when
Yes.
you're improvising in a group, it's like there's no lack of new things that are being created. You just respond to it. You can either mimic it or play something to go against it or support it in some way, or be silent. You can
Mm.
give space and just let the one soloist play what they need to play.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love that. The dialogue, the conversation, the back and forth, the interplay, the interconnectedness. And it's interesting because I do relate to that. Only when you listen back, you realize if you
Mm-hmm.
wit, you don't, you're not witnessing everything in the moment, right? We're just flowing, and then you come back and like you said, who played that, or did that come out of me? Or
Mm-hmm.
I remember and this is a really interesting thing about it for me. Now, I don't probably don't sing the same thing twice with my music, and I don't go out and perform my tracks. What I do is I improvise again live. So everything is always
Oh,
shifting and
cool.
moving. But
Mm-hmm.
I remembered in my contemporary music singing career days, which I don't do much of in the same way, I was singing for a tribute band, a Pink Floyd tribute band. And the tour that we were doing at the time was the Dark Side of the Moon album, which has a song called Great Gig in the
Oh,
Sky.
wow.
So a
That's
lot
one of
of
my favorite
musicians,
vocal solos.
oh my gosh, it's incredible. It's one of the hardest vocals that I've had
Oof.
to do in my career
Yeah.
to date, though. Nothing
Yeah.
has ever touched it. But as you know, then it is just a big wailing, beautiful improv.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to learn someone else's improv.
Oh, right. So you did the exact one that she did on the recording, basically.
Yeah, that's pretty
Okay.
much what they wanted to do. With the
Mm-hmm.
tribute bands, it's trying to sound exactly like
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
original. And
Mm-hmm.
so I had to go as deep into learning somebody else's improv, which was a really interesting experience for me
Mm-hmm.
because hers was so not, I mean, obviously it's recorded, it's captured. So their structure when you listen to it afterwards, and that you go into it
Mm-hmm.
over and over again, you can pull out the salient points sonically and
Mm-hmm.
repeat them. But that
Mm-hmm.
was such an interesting experience for me as we're
Mm.
talking about that
Yeah.
remembering of improv. Learning someone else's was
Right.
incredibly interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, do you know, like on the original recording, did she like do that in like one take, or was that something
I'm
that,
not sure if she did it
yeah,
in one take, but since then, I know that when Pink Floyd did a lot of live music, they always shared that with two singers or three singers.
right.
They hardly ever tended to have one singer doing it
Mm-hmm.
in live scenarios,
Mm-hmm.
which was interesting. So when I did it, I did it by myself for most of the tour, and they brought another singer on for one event where we shared it.
Okay.
Uh, but I did most of it, so I had to learn all three parts of it that I guess that they would break down in a live setting. But in terms of whether she did it in one take or not, I have no idea. That would be an interesting thing to find out.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Are there any recordings of you doing that?
I'm sure somewhere. I don't have
Okay.
any online, but I'm sure I have it somewhere in the archives. I
Mm-hmm.
almost thought that I lost them all when I had changed computers because I'm talking a good 15, maybe a little longer than that, 20 years ago almost.
Right.
But yes, I'm sure I do somewhere. I'll have to dig it up. But
Yeah.
yes,
I'd love to hear that.
it was really interesting for me, those experiences, because it was, and then it was never exactly the same, but there were elements where I would capture the main points that
Mm-hmm.
people would probably expect if they're listening to that piece again.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so learning improv, it's an
Mm-hmm.
interesting paradox, that one for me.
Yeah. I know there's bands, there's a Grateful Dead cover band called, I think they're called Splintered Sunlight, and they learn entire Grateful Dead shows, which have long sections of improv, and they learn like all the guitar solos and everything note for note, and they replay complete Grateful Dead sets. That way they learn the improv and they recreate it. So
wow, yeah, can you imagine that the what has to go into that to make it come alive?
yeah, totally.
Yeah. So tell me about your new album, because I know you've got a lot of beautiful music out there. Tell us about the new one.
Yeah, the latest. Well, I did two albums and sort of the end of last year. One was called Indra's Net, which was it's a concept in Buddhism as well, and that one's a bunch of shorter uh, musical fragments that were compiled from pieces that I share with people that follow me on Patreon. So I have a Patreon, and basically every Monday I post a meditative soundscape that people can listen to for that week.
Nice.
So this was kind of like taking little fragments of that, of each of those longer soundscapes, and kind of doing little bite-sized tracks to listen. And it's this idea of Indra's net, that in each jewel of this net are reflected all the other jewels that are in this cosmic web of interconnectedness. So that was an album I put out last fall. And then the most recent album is called Sonochroma, which is sono for sound and chroma for color. And it's an album where I took the frequencies of the colors of the light spectrum, so red down to violet, and there is a chart called the angstrom that takes the frequency of the color, so let's say the color blue, and transposes that down, because light frequencies are much higher, like up in the tens of thousands of hertz, lowered it down into the hertz that are visible on a keyboard. So they created sort of melodic, or let's say audible versions of each of the colors. And if I have the album on Bandcamp, and there's a link to the full chart of those. So basically I took those frequencies and I created an album that's that uses sonic color therapy. So you can listen, each track is 13 minutes long, 13 minutes and 31 seconds. And you can listen to each of the colors, a sonic representation of the color. And so if you're into color therapy, and there's a lot of, some people call it a pseudoscience, but again, it's one of these placebo effect things that if shining an orange colored light on you makes you feel good, please do it. And so this is an album that's a soundtrack where you can use it in combination with color therapy, or you can just listen to the colors by themselves as a sonic way for the sort of synesthesically to listen to those colors.
Yeah, that is so beautiful. And I have to say that when I popped in to check out your music, that I was so, I don't know, maybe I want to say the sonic nerd in me got lit up. I was just like, oh my gosh, yes, and very specific, but yet improvised and open and spacious. But I love that. And I am going to definitely be putting all these links, these gorgeous links to your Sangha and all of the stuff that you're doing, for people to check out your amazing work. But I do have to say thank you, because this, it's so lovely to come together and speak with people and learn and grow and expand. And sometimes even for me, especially when there's so much synergy, music, therapeutic sound, mindfulness, and all of this, that there's always a new way of hearing it, and a different reflection that is so breathtaking. So I'm really grateful. Thank you for sharing all that yumminess.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm so happy to connect, and hopefully continue to stay connected. And
yes, for sure.
Work on some music someday, or who knows?
Yes, I think that sounds good.
Yeah.
And I do ask all of my guests the same question at the end, and that is, what is your soulful sound to the world? And that is a self-prayer or desire that you wish upon the world.
Well, there's so much, with media, we're really learning and hearing about so much horror and violence, from Congo to Gaza to Ukraine. And earlier I was talking about the therapeutic benefits of silence. And if we live in a place where there is silence, that's such a gift. So many people would love to have that silence, to not hear the sounds, in the extreme cases of places like Gaza, of war, sounds of poverty, the oppressive nature of many of our soundscapes. So I just wish for more silence, more space for people to listen, for a quieter world, for silent nights, as we sing about it in the holidays and Christmas time, more silent nights for people.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, here's to more silence and deep listening. Thanks again for your time, Michael.
Thank you, Simone.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Your support, your comments, and everything is truly incredible, and we're only at the beginning of this awesome journey together. If you love this episode, hit that like and subscribe button, and make sure to check out our other episodes. Thanks so much for being with us today, sending you love, healing, and sound wherever you are.